that's the really exciting thing for Tasmanians as well. It was only about a year ago we were talking about how hydrogen vehicles probably weren't going to be competitive because of the cost of hydrogen versus the cost of petrol. Now, and at the time, it was $15 a kilogram for 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And it takes 5 kilograms of hydrogen to fill your vehicle. Well, that's around $65. I'd like to know anybody that can actually fuel their vehicle for $65 these days.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of the Tasmanian Politics Podcast. I'm Simon Behrakis, and we've got Felix Ellis here, and also we're joined by our guest today, Susie Bower, who's the CEO of the Bell Bay Advanced Manufacturing Zone. Welcome, Susie. Thanks for coming on the show, and please tell us a bit about yourself and what's going on up in Bell Bay.
Thanks, Simon. So really excited to be with you guys today. I guess a little bit about myself. So I'm obviously the CEO of the Bell Bay Advanced Manufacturing Zone. I've also been a Meander Valley councillor, so we'll have something about that to talk about later. And also a project I guess I'm particularly proud about is I was the project manager for the Blue Derby mountain bike trails as well. So a bit of a diverse background, local government, tourism, and also now manufacturing in the private sector. Now, I've been in this space in hydrogen for about 3 years now. And so what I want to talk about, I guess, is exactly why is hydrogen important for us in Tasmania. So it is seen as a way to actually decarbonise the global economy. So it's not just around trucks, cars and buses and ships, which is really important, but it's actually as a replacement for coal in power generation and steel manufacturing. That's why it's so important to the global economy. So irrespective of your views on climate change and its causes, the future trend is for energy that generates no carbon emissions when produced and consumed. So how exactly is hydrogen made? I'll give you a one-on-one because that's about all I can do.
In there, Susie, what are the emissions of hydrogen when they're used to
It's
power
water.
plants?
So when you actually, it just water evaporates. So that is there is no CO2 emissions with hydrogen.
Cool.
So if we're in your car, out from your exhaust to give it is just a water. Water drops out of your exhaust, and that's all that it produces when you've got a hydrogen-powered vehicle.
Yep.
So when you need 2 things to make hydrogen, which is water and electricity. So and an electrolyzer actually. So water and it goes through an electrolyzer, and it produces 2 things, hydrogen and oxygen. And oxygen is actually the byproduct. And oxygen can actually be used for other things such as fish farms in Tasmania as well. So it actually has another use that it can go on to, particularly in a Tasmanian environment. You typically have 3 types of hydrogen: green, blue and black hydrogen. So green hydrogen is actually produced by renewable sources. So that's around our hydroelectricity here. It's around wind and solar. Blue hydrogen is produced by natural gas, and brown or black hydrogen is actually produced by coal. So for Tasmania, we would be purely around green hydrogen. So why would we want to have hydrogen in Tassie, and particularly in Bell Bay? There's probably 5 key elements that actually make Tasmania stand out in the world to produce green hydrogen. We have access to we have access to a deep water port at Bell Bay. We have access to water. We have access to power. We have access to industrial land there, and we have access to an already existing skilled workforce that can actually transition and upskill to actually utilise hydrogen. So for me, what makes it so exciting for Tasmania is the opportunity to actually become a world leader in the production of green hydrogen and actually produce a whole new industry and job creation for our future generations.
So, Susie, I might ask a question there, because I'm a plumber and a gas fitter, and interestingly enough, we got an email the other day, all of us long-suffering plumbers, about potentially upskilling in hydrogen and using the skills that we have, doing gas fitting to plug into the new sort of hydrogen economy as well. And I think from memory, the TasGas pipeline is starting to put a bit of hydrogen, or looking to put a bit of hydrogen in there as well. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so gas is a really good skill set to have in relation to upskilling to hydrogen. It's just at a much higher pressure when you're dealing with hydrogen versus gas. So there's a little bit more safety elements to it, but anyone with gas fitting qualifications will be able to upskill really easily into the hydrogen industry. The other question, I guess, around... actually, I've forgotten what the other question was. What was it?
I think I was asking around the TasGas pipeline and putting a bit of hydrogen in there.
So essentially in the Tasmanian gas line, because it is a fairly new pipeline, we can actually put 10% hydrogen into the gas line as a blend. You can't do that with a lot of other states because the infrastructure isn't suitable for hydrogen to be put into the pipeline, but in Tasmania we can. So TasGas in particular are looking at working with proponents right now, and there was one announced a couple of weeks ago that will be starting up in Brighton that will actually be going straight, putting hydrogen straight into the gas pipeline to actually provide an energy source to an industrial state in Brighton.
Yeah, fantastic.
I've got a question, Susie, just about the applications of hydrogen and all of this. I know there's hydrogen in an industrial capacity, like you've said, and also in cars. We've heard the announcement about Porsche putting in there, or looking at putting in a hydrogen plant in Tasmania as well. I know all the talk at the moment, the vogue thing is electric vehicles and electric everything. So I suppose what's the benefits of hydrogen in that space, and how does that play differently to electric vehicles?
Yeah, particularly hydrogen is probably better used in heavy vehicles as opposed to your normal car. Electric is quite suitable for your normal domestic car use. But when you're starting to look at heavy industry, fuel replacement for diesel with heavy industry is much more efficient and better for, the number of trucks that we have, for example, just on the Tasmanian roads is quite a lot. I think there was like 70,000 odd trucks in Tasmania. So it's quite a big transport industry that we can actually, get rid of some of those emissions that are coming out, and with electric vehicles, there's still a little way to go in how long you can actually get out of it. So most electric vehicles, 400 to 500 Ks, maybe 5 at the most before you need to recharge. And when you do need to recharge an electric vehicle, unless you've got a fast charger, it takes more than 2 hours. With a hydrogen vehicle, for example, it takes 3 minutes to fill up a hydrogen vehicle. So when you're actually refueling it. And it goes for up to 600 to 1,000 kilometres before you need to actually refuel.
Yeah, so that was always I know I'm a city slicker compared to you two, but it's always one of the things I've wondered about electric vehicles is when you've got like long haul trucks, long distance delivery drivers, and applications like you've said that require high torque sort of settings, how electric vehicles are going to play into that. But this is a good alternative for at least until the electric sector catches up in the technology for that.
Yeah, and certainly there's still a long way to go for hydrogen with vehicles as well. When you start looking at a truck, for example, a normal diesel truck will cost you about $250,000 new. If you're looking at a hydrogen truck, it'll cost you around about, at the moment, $650,000. So when you look over the life of the vehicle, you really have to, determine what's going to be best and more cost efficient for you. And this is where I actually think government, though, can play a really big role, is when getting to that transition component. So until we actually reach critical mass, then that's when the prices will start to come down and industry can take over. But until you get to there, there's not much of an incentive really, is there, for people in the business to actually switch over to a hydrogen vehicle from a purely economic point of view when you're looking at that price differentiation. So whether there are incentives or other things that actually government can play to actually get that transition happening quicker so that we can actually start getting that critical mass happening.
And because, Susie, is it right in saying that the reason why a lot of this stuff is around hydrogen has come online is actually governments around the world, say for example in Japan, looking to do hydrogen as part of their fuel transitions?
Definitely. They have some really aggressive strategies to get to net zero, and it's by 2030. And the amount that just Japan itself needs, we couldn't even produce right now. Even if we've got 4 major players all looking at exporting ammonia, so they'll actually be making hydrogen making hydrogen and then converting it to ammonia. The reason for that is we know how to actually transport ammonia. We still have a little bit of way to go before we actually can transport safely hydrogen, especially in a liquid form. So what you can do, you can either use ammonia as the fuel source, and which they will be doing, or when it actually gets to its destination, you can actually crack it back to hydrogen and then use it on site. So it will lose some as you crack it back, but it is possible then it's a much safer transport for most people as well.
And I know a lot of farmers who live in my area, their ears would have been pricking up at the you mentioning ammonia, particularly with the situation with fertilizer and the prices just going through the roof and difficulty in getting it. Is fertilizer an opportunity as part of the whole hydrogen ammonia stuff?
I would love to see this opportunity, especially if we've got 4 major players, as I said, Woodside, Fortescue, Origin, and Able Energy. 3 of those will be using ammonia. The 4th one is methanol. But with those 3 with ammonia, I would love to see that as another supply chain that we could actually start producing in Tasmania and bring some of that security back to Australia as well. When we're talking about fertiliser, it's mainly out of Russia and China is my understanding at the moment, and that's why the prices are nearly tenfold what they used to be, is because we know some of those issues in those 2 countries. So if we can actually start bringing back some of that manufacturing sovereignty back to Australia and that supply chain surety, then I think that's fantastic for our country.
I think that last point's a really interesting one, Susie, on the sovereignty of our manufacturing, because I think it's a really important one. And I suppose this is where we risk getting a little bit political again. But you've seen sort of over the years, there's always a tendency to, or why don't we make a place wonderful and cosy, and we won't have any big manufacturing because it's the pretense is that any sort of heavy manufacturing is bad for the environment. And then we have the risk of, in the end, losing that sovereignty and a lot of manufacturing around not just Tasmania but Australia. And actually, I think in much of the Western world that there was that loss of manufacturing sovereignty, and there's countries now trying to pull that back. And I think that's really important. I think it does play into. I think a lot of people look at hydrogen, look at sort of those emerging technologies as high level stuff. It's far away, but it's stuff that really has the potential to affect people's lives and improve people's lives. And I think that's an important thing. I think there's a lot of issues where, especially in politics, people get caught up in the issues that are sexy at the time, or the vogue issues that are sort of within the Salamanca bubble or the Canberra bubble, and don't necessarily think on what are the issues that everyday people care about, what are the issues that are affecting everyday people. When you talk about cost of living, you talk about things that will impact on their energy and make life easier for them, or potentially make life harder for them if we get it wrong. So just wondering what either of you had to think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at our construction industry, for example, at the moment, and the supply chain issues we had there around they're having to order 3 to 6 months in advance just to get enough to actually build what they need to build. And they're booked 2 years in advance at the moment. And a lot of that stuff is still coming from China, and they're relying on that to come here to be actually, make we can have commitments for how many houses we build, but we can't build them if we don't have the supplies, so we can't build them as quickly as perhaps we'd like to. And that is becoming a real issue. And a lot of construction companies too in Tasmania have to carry a lot of cost. So there's a lot of debt at the moment that they're carrying because they actually can't get through things quickly enough, or prices actually increase halfway through a build, and there's nothing they can actually do about it. Sometimes they just have to wear that cost. So it's actually a bit of a tricky one for some of our construction industry at the moment in Tasmania, and I know that there's some of them are just sort of trying to skate through, and that's why a lot of them are sort of refusing some work because they just can't afford to take it on and take that more debt, and they just don't have the cash flow to do so.
And it's crazy with as you say, the supply chain issues in terms of time and cost. There's more work now for most people working in construction than they've ever seen in their lives. And yet we've got some of these big construction companies, whether it's here in Tassie or whether it's on the mainland, going broke. This strange kind of contradiction of more work and yet not being able to stay in business. It's troubling times for a lot of people in that area.
And part of that is, and as was said, there's supply issues. Everybody's saying that we want to build more houses. It's one of the few things that I think everybody in politics agrees on, and it's the getting those houses built where I think people start to fall over along the way. But the supply issues and the issue of supplies, it's quite funny because I remember last year there's a huge issue of getting wood for framing for houses. And we have wood, we just don't have the capacity to harvest it now, and part of that reason is because of the ongoing political issues around forestry in Tasmania as well. So you have people that have effectively hamstrung our ability to build those supplies up internally, and are now decrying the fact that we can't get those houses built.
I mean, Timberlink is one of our businesses that we represent, and they produce a lot of the timber for housing in Tasmania, Victoria and New South Wales in particular. And they were telling me a story not so long ago about a delivery from Timberlink on a truck at Bex, and there were tradespeople fighting over the load as it came off the truck. Yeah. It's a pretty sad state of affairs there when that's happening, but that's the reality at the moment.
Absolutely. And even say someone was talking before about, one of the things that's really impacting people's lives, and that's on the price of fuel, petrol, diesel. One of the interesting opportunities, I think, with hydrogen, which we touched on just before, with HIF Global and Porsche looking to do a methanol plant up in my neck of the woods near the big plantation estate at Surrey Hills, is that opportunity to onshore some of our liquid fuel production. I mean, we sort of almost never have the discussion in Australia about energy independence, which is quite common in, say, a place like the United States, because we just haven't had that much, light sweet crude that you can use in some of these in these liquid fuels. But to be able to decouple ourselves from a commodity that's produced mostly in dictatorships that hate us, that get transshipped a long way across the world in a very expensive, messy and complicated supply chain that's quite vulnerable, to be able to actually do it all on the island. That is in itself, I think, a huge benefit to some of this stuff if it comes to fruition.
Oh, definitely. That's the really exciting thing for Tasmanians as well. It was only about a year ago we were talking about how hydrogen vehicles probably weren't going to be competitive because of the cost of hydrogen versus the cost of petrol. Now, and at the time, it was $15 a kilogram for 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And it takes 5 kilograms of hydrogen to fill your vehicle. Well, that's around $65. I'd like to know anybody that can actually fuel their vehicle for $65 these days. So,
you maybe do your lawnmower at the moment.
Exactly. So even 1 year and things have changed dramatically. And so I think there's some real opportunity for Tasmania as in the domestic market. So we've probably talked a little bit about those big players which are part of the export market, but we also have some smaller players like Countrywide, Line Hydrogen, that are actually wanting to operate in the domestic market for Tasmania, and this is where this could have a great impact and a great benefit for the community, and being able to produce our own fuel at a much lesser cost and not having any scarcity of it and worrying about someone else producing it. We can do it all.
And I think that's a really important point by both of you. It's not, we talk about energy security. I think energy security is one of those things where if you don't address it and take it seriously when you don't need to worry about it, if you're addressing it when you do need to worry about it, that's a serious problem. Like you don't want to be forced into a situation where you're talking about energy security. Same as food security or timber and supply security. It's something you want to be proactive on. And I think a lot of people minimise that. But also, like you said, we're not far away from this being a really practical option from a cost perspective for an everyday person. It's something, with fuel prices going all over the place at the moment. This is something that could be a real option for affordable commuting and transport for the everyday person.
Yeah, again, it's getting that critical mass so that it brings the cost of the vehicle down. The vehicle itself, whether it's a truck or a car, still a lot more expensive than a petrol or diesel vehicle at the moment.
And before we maybe go into a couple of interesting things around council that are going on at the moment, because I know that our fledgling audience loves talking about council, I might just, because you did mention green steel, Susie, and maybe would you be able to give our audience a sense, particularly in this manufacturing space, how hydrogen can play a part in that?
Yeah, so GFG,
and what is it as well? What is green steel?
It's basically how you produce it. Again, it's like anything that we produce. It's how it's actually made. Typically, to get the heat that you need for a lot of these processes, coal has been the go-to because it can get to that heat. Hydrogen can actually replace that. Sometimes it still needs to be coupled with gas to be able to get to the heat that it requires. Other times there are processes where hydrogen will be able to be used and get to the heat required. When you're talking Rio Tinto, for example, they need around 800 to 900 degrees Celsius for their melting pots around aluminium. But when you go up to Railton, up in your neck of the woods, it's 1,200, cement. That goes a much, much higher heating process that you need there. So it really depends on the process, but you can do this with green steel, and GFG at Temco, who also own Whyalla, the plant in Whyalla, are investigating how to make green steel at the moment and looking at bringing that technology to Tasmania and looking at manufacturing it with the manganese that we already produce, which is part of what you need for steel making, and using it again. It's the process to make the steel which makes it green. Doesn't mean it's it's much strong. It's just as strong. It doesn't weaken it.
I might be showing my ignorance on steel production, but I always was under the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that the carbon content of the coal was a factor in the creation of, or in the production of steel as well. Or am I completely off base there?
No, again, there's a lot of technology, a lot of things still needing to progress to be able to get into there. That's why there's a lot of investigation at the moment on how this can actually play a part. But you'll have the technology that is required along with the hydrogen source.
Mm. Well, that's and it is fascinating because people often don't realise that. Tasmania's largest mine is an iron ore mine in my neck of the woods in Savage River, and we've got a lot of the raw materials here. If you take out metallurgical coal, which obviously we have some coal, but it's not of metallurgical quality, so it's huge opportunities. But now, speaking of other huge opportunities, I wanted to ask you guys. Obviously, Simon's made a big announcement today, looking very swish that he's going to be running for Deputy Mayor of Hobart. Susie, I know you're a Meander Valley councillor formerly as well, and been involved with local government, as you say, out at Dorset, and mixed up with the Derby mountain bikes too. It's one of the big challenges for our state. How do we make sure that local government is delivering for people on their priorities?
I've put all my cards on the table today and announcing that I'm running for Deputy Mayor, because at the end of the day, without giving the sales pitch, I think that what Hobart deserves better than what it's got in the last 4 years. There's been a lot of ideology pushed in the council. I think it's probably the most political council that Hobart's seen, I think, ever. And at the end of the day, look, just recently council commissioned a survey of the community and asked them what the issues that they cared about were, and where they think council was doing well and where they think council weren't doing well. And there was 3 issues that everybody, business, community, said that Hobart was falling behind on. It was parking, it was congestion, and it was planning and housing. Those, and then daylight second, and everything else was also down pretty good, or really, really, really okay.
So it's meat and potatoes kind of stuff.
That affect people's lives. How are they going to? How do they get to where they're going? How do they leave their car where it is that they need to be going? And how do they afford somewhere to live? And how does the city grow? These are the issues that people care about. Council spends so much time talking about just about everything else. We're talking about this nuclear disarmament and council's opinion on that being somehow relevant to not just the issue itself, but the everyday lives of the people who live in the city. And I think that everybody who lives here deserves better than that. I think Hobart's probably the worst culprit for that. that sort of navel-gazing, virtue signalling sort of politicking going on in councils that have no bearing on the lives of the ratepaying public. But I think it's something that's sort of happening in councils a lot. I think they're getting used as soapboxes by people that want a voice rather than the sort of really good community-minded people that councils have been known for. So I'd be interested to hear Susie's take on this from the other end of the state and how different or similar it might be.
Yeah, well, I haven't been in council for a year, so I'll have to do a disclaimer there. But planning is one of the biggest issues that I hear all of the time, and I still hear it now. That's the biggest complaint. I have a very different view to some other people about planning. I actually don't think it belongs in council. I actually think that it should be moved out of the council environment. It's absolutely pointless, and a lot of community members don't understand that when you're acting as a planning authority in council, you have to work under statutory regulations. So whether you agree or disagree with the plan, like a planner's recommendation comes through, if it actually ticks off on every single box within the planning scheme, then and you know the community don't want it, and you vote against it. The developer just takes it to appeal, it gets overturned, and the council's up for costs. If you don't do it, you go against your community and they think you're the worst in the world because you've made a decision that they actually don't want in their community, but they don't understand you're acting as a legal entity, and you actually can't, if you do make a decision that's contrary to the planners without real cause or justification, it's just a waste of time. So I'm like, my goodness, just take this away from council. Let councils do what they should be doing, is listening to their community, looking at what ways they can make their communities better, and just take planning out of it, because it causes the most controversy, and it's the one you actually can't do anything about anyway.
You're 100% correct. I'd go a little bit further and say it's not just the public that misunderstands the role of councils in planning. I think a lot of councillors misunderstand the role of councils in planning. You have people, I'm going to vote against this, or I've had colleagues of mine say in council meetings, in planning committee meetings, I acknowledge that this complies with the planning scheme criteria, however, I'm not comfortable supporting it, so I'm not going to support it. Like, it's, like you said, even if you love a project, but if you look at it and you know that it doesn't tick those boxes, you're not supposed to vote for it. And obviously vice versa, which happens a lot. And as you said, it goes to the tribunal. It gets knocked back. We usually get a pretty sort of harsh, response back from the tribunal. The endorsement of the tribunal recommendation always comes back to us in the closed meeting, so the public rarely sees it. But at the end of the day, when you say cost, we're talking $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to defend poor decisions made at a council level that the ratepayers pay for. So the ratepayers aren't just getting a poor outcome from a planning perspective; they're also paying for that poor outcome. And at the end of the day, we have this statutory responsibility as planners or as a planning authority. We're told at the end. I don't know what it was like on the Meander Valley Council, but we go into council and the mayor or the chair of the committee will stop and say, "Okay, council's now acting as a planning authority. You're supposed to take your councillor politician hat off and put your statutory planning authority hat on. And then you're supposed to act like you're not making decisions politically." And that is what our statutory responsibilities are. But I think it's a bit unrealistic to expect that people who are elected and hope to get re-elected are going to be making decisions that the community cares about without having a political perspective to it. And I just don't think it is.
Yeah, and I've even known councillors, because they get to know who will actually do the right thing, and if they know that a majority of councillors are going to vote for this particular development, so to get through and do all the right things because it was told by the planner, it ticks all the boxes, they'll actually vote against it because they know some community members are really against it. So they do play the political game because they know that there will be the majority will do the right thing, so it'll still get through, but then they'll get to look good by actually going with the community and saying, "No, I didn't vote for that." And that gets
it's
really
very interesting
annoying.
you say that, because there's a few of them on my council as well, but there's one story that I won't say who it is because I don't want to get a code of conduct complaint against me. But there was one story where somebody was late to to a vote. So the numbers in committee were not we don't do pairs in council, obviously. And one of the Greens members was slightly annoyed after the meeting that the person was late, because it meant that they had to vote. Their vote was now like a deciding vote, and they wanted to vote against it, knowing that it should have been approved, but they could have the cake and eat it too. It wasn't. This was obviously none of this was on the record. It was after the meeting, but there was if only such and such came earlier, it would have been the right decision. Like, if it's the right decision, you should have voted the right way, shouldn't you?
Correct. That's exactly right.
Against it, so they can go back to their supporters and go back to the community and say, look, I stood up for you. But at the end of the day, when you're acting as a planning authority, you're there to make decisions against the criteria, not to make decisions about whether or not you think that the world should be this way or another. And I think you're right. Perhaps the right thing to do is to give up any pretense of this and let councillors be political, because they are, and let a separate statutory body assess planning. That's they can still have deputations, they can still make representations, they can still appeal decisions if they're not happy with them. Just take the politics out of the question. And I think that will result in better decision making at a council level on the issues the council is focused on, and I think it will result in better planning.
And you could actually make up that body by the planners on different councils, so that they actually rotate, so that you're actually getting different planners' opinions on different councils' planning applications, to make sure there's some consistency in what's happening around the state.
And then planners don't.
Now, can I ask one specifically for all the people in the Hobart bubble that will be very passionate about this? If we made the changes you're proposing, would we get a cable car built on Mount Wellington?
Funny you say that, because I obviously have my views on the cable car. But the cable car application...
What are they, Simon?
In the context of maintaining my responsibilities as statutory planning authority, I think that might be best left unsaid. The cable car project application that was put, I'm not talking about the broader issue of the cable car, but just this application, was recommended for refusal by officers. So... for all the talk and politicking of people saying, if we lose this, bad decisions are going to get made, we won't be able to, stop horrible planning and what have you, all the applications and all the projects that they point to as examples would have also been refused under what would be a better system. The cable car application that my council decided last year would have been refused if it was left to the planners. So the sky wouldn't fall in, but you'd have quicker decisions being made, and I think you'd ultimately have better decisions. You would have multiple. We've got there's a few that I can't specifically talk about because they're still in the closed part of council decision making. But we've got dwellings of about in the order of about 50 or 60 dwellings in just 2 or 3 projects that were refused by council, and they've come back, and we've now determined that we kind of have to accept it, that it's what do you call it, approvable. So the end result is those houses get built. Usually they end up going from 60 dwellings to 50 dwellings instead. They get crunched down and negotiated down. The end result there is just 10 fewer people with homes. But look, we could go on about that for a long time. Something that we thought we'd try.
I won't tempt you
up for it. So Susie is Felix and I asked around to see if anybody had any questions of us, and we thought we'd do a bit of a Q&A. So we'll do a couple, and some of them are interesting. We thought we'd pick the best 3 or 4. So the first one we have from Graham. Are non-elected community groups given too much say in public policy in Tasmania? I think a lot of people are expecting me to say yes, thinking of a few certain groups. But I think there's a lot of community groups that do a really good advocacy in the community, whether it's at a state or federal or local level. When you see some, you're a councillor, Susie. I'm an alderman. Felix is a member of parliament. As much as we might like to think so, we're not. We don't know everything, and we're not perfect. And certain things arise, and certain things pop up as issues that we don't know until people bring them to our attention. And it takes groups that are willing to speak out and bring things to our attention and show us, you've said that you're going to do this, but hang on, this and this and this is an issue for this community. that let us know that things are an issue, or that maybe the council or government's going in the wrong direction. But then on the flip side, you do have groups that do make up and do sort of represent that quote unquote noisy minority. And we haven't been over. There's multiple sort of very, very politically slick anti-development lobbying groups that will go around and numerous times bully and try and pressure elected members to vote a certain way to represent a very small minority of the population. So I think that's what has been referred to in the question here. I think broadly the answer is no, but when you do have some groups that I think go beyond that and act like they've got the right to dictate what those decisions are, and that's where it becomes a bit dangerous with non-elected people claiming to speak on behalf of other people.
And you can get that with individuals as well. You'll get your very noisy individuals on nearly every issue, but you get to know who they are pretty quickly. And I'm not saying that they're not valuable, and they shouldn't be listened to, because sometimes it does allow you to think about something a little bit differently and perhaps open your mind a little bit to a difference of opinion. But you still take you really do need to stay connected to your community. And it does annoy me when elected members get elected, listen to their community, and then you never see them for another 4 years. They don't go to any events. They don't stay connected to what their community is talking about and what the concerns are of their community. If you're elected, you're there for 4 years, and I think you should be going to events and staying as closely connected to your community as possible. So when these issues do come up, you can actually see through some of those things and see through some of those groups. I'm not saying ignore them, because they can bring up some really important points that you may not have thought about, and it does. But you also get, you get really good advice too, coming from professional people from council. You take that into consideration with community, and you make a decision. I don't like people that sit on the fence and never make a decision. It's hard enough to get things through council now and takes long enough now without, if you consulted on every single thing.
Some particularly, there's way too much focus on these groups. Obviously, a lot of people know my opinions on the Bob Brown Foundation and some of those wilderness society types that, there's a tiny number of these people who, chain themselves to machinery, lock people out of their workplaces, make life just a living nightmare for people, working in our productive industries. They get a massive amount of coverage from the media that's particularly sympathetic. And the guys and girls that are working in mining, fisheries, forestry, aquaculture, they're all too busy going to work. It's the old, and, sorry to be a liberal here, but Menzies forgotten people. They don't necessarily have a group to organise and advocate for their voice. And so despite the fact that we've got, a tiny number of people from the Bob Brown Foundation making a lot of noise, they're the ones that get all the coverage. And the people that are keeping the state ticking over, aside from people, say, in our positions as elected people, they don't really have too many people that are willing to advocate for them, or a media that's sympathetic to their lives and livelihoods that will cover them.
Well, I must commend Felix, the government, in the recent changes in law to actually give more powers so that people can actually go about their jobs. And these people are not trained in conflict resolution or, all of these things, and they're just confronted with these things and they're not really sure what to do. And a lot of these as they're paid by the load. If they stop, that means that they're not getting fed that week, So have a think about that when you're stopping someone from actually going to work, what effect that's having right now as well with the cost of living and everything else. You're actually stopping them from actually making a living that day. They don't get paid by sitting there.
This is one that we can go on, and I'll just say one more bit on this. I think, and you made a really good point just then, Susie. You got people that say, look, we're peacefully protesting. You can't stop us from peacefully protesting. If you're depriving somebody of the freedom to work and to put food on the table, you might get a good Facebook post out of this and a good write-up in the newspaper that you're fighting a good fight for whatever it is that you're fighting for, or you think you're fighting for. But that's not without harm. You've stopped an everyday person that's just doing their job from effectively being able to get paid, and that like you said, with cost of living going up, that could be the difference between him having food on the table for his kids. But look, we can go on this one for a while. We've got another question here. by someone who I'm not sure is a fan of yours, Felix. There's a lot of preamble bagging you out here, but effectively, why?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so this actually probably lines up quite well with some of the discussion we were having around council and planning and taking the elected person hat off and putting on the statutory authority. So the Public Works Committee, which I'm a part of, is involved in approving projects on behalf of the Tasmanian Parliament that are over a certain amount of money. So they're larger projects. We're talking, or in the Burnie Court's case, about $40 million. Projects around $15 million plus. And so our job is to look at a few things, whether a project is value for money, whether it meets a need, and effectively, is it a good idea to go about this project? Now, in the case of the Burnie Court, those from around the state may not have followed this closely, but the initial plan was to move the court, which is old and dilapidated. There's poor disability access, security is an issue. It effectively does not serve. It's not fit for purpose. So we need a new facility, whether that's through renovation or others. We initially looked at renovating. There's a heap of friable asbestos, so anyone in construction knows that friable asbestos is the really bad asbestos that breaks up. It's already broken up. It's kind of crumbly, rather than the normal non-friable stuff that you see in normal houses and stuff like that. So we needed to move because we couldn't do that. We couldn't renovate that during a working with a working court. Now, in the process of moving, there's local residents. It was going to be up in the suburbs, and they weren't happy with having the court facility there. Now, our job as a Public Works Committee is to look into, as I said before, whether things are value for money, whether it serves a purpose, and whether it meets a need. Planning is not one of those things, and so the location of, say, something like the Burnie Court is more focused on, say, for example, something that council would look at. In the Public Works Committee, we don't have a single staff member trained in planning that can give us advice, which gives you a sense of what the Public Works Committee is actually looking at and doing. So, look, the recent news this week is that we've got our expression of interest process to look for sites back in the CBD have closed. We've got 3 sites, one at the old one of the existing Advocate building, one across the road from the police station, another one that's being investigated confidentially, but more details will be known. So I won't bore our statewide audience with this one, but effectively it's a question of what is the role of the Public Works Committee and what can we do? Clearly we need a new courthouse, and that's what the Public Works Committee found.
Well, can I just say that, we're about to come up to, people are now, probably around about now, trying to make decisions on whether they think they should stand for local government. I would highly recommend anyone that is passionate, like we've heard Simon is very passionate about making a difference in his community, put your hand up. It is one of the most rewarding things you can do. Probably a little bit challenging, but if you're passionate about your community and you want to make a difference like Simon, please think about putting your hand up and representing your community in the upcoming council elections.
Yeah, I think we do need people that are motivated, people that are passionate to represent the community, and care about the community to run. We need more of that. Look, just a good one, I think, to finish off on, because we have got a little bit over time, just slightly. It's from a friend of the podcast, a former guest, Louise Elliott. She asked, and it's similar to one of the other questions, how do you determine the views of the majority when the minority can be so loud?
So the difference between what you read in the papers or hear on talkback radio and what you hear from people when you knock on their door and say, "G'day, I'm Felix, what are the issues that are most important to you at the moment?" It is night and day. Like, so much of this stuff you wouldn't read in the newspaper, but it's the phrase used before, it's the meat and potatoes of life. People want to make sure that they can afford to feed their kids, give them a good education, make sure that their families are looked after with their healthcare and have a decent job. It's a lot of that stuff is almost obvious, but we can forget if we spend too much time listening to the noisy people in the media that amplify them.
Yeah, I think with the answer, which is very similar to what both of you have said, it takes a lot of work. if you sometimes the issue of the day in the media, the issue on social media that you see people carrying on about is an issue that people care about. So you need to know what your community is saying to know whether or not the issue is a real one. I've worked for numerous politicians in different levels of government and myself on council. You get a lot of correspondence when issues pop up. And I've always said, I think 95% of the correspondence you receive is either, politically attacking you or raising issues that aren't issues or whatever, but you don't know until you read them. Because you might read something and on face value you go, oh, that's a bit sort of silly, but if you read it through, you go, oh, actually this person's raising a real issue here. And it's the same with the issues of the day. The only way to know what your community is really thinking and whether an issue is a serious one or it's been trumped up by a minority group is to go around, as Felix said, and door knock or go around to community events and just be around in the community and talk to people. Because you'll find out very quickly if people have an issue, they'll tell you. And if you've just got the same 2 or 3 people coming to you saying this is a bit, the people of Hobart or the people of Tasmania demand something on this, and when you do a survey or it comes to election time, it turns out that no, they actually really didn't. That you do get a measure for that, but only if you put the work in and actually talk to people and listen to people, and not just listen to what they're saying, but actually hear what they're saying. Look, I think we could talk for hours and hours and hours. This has been a really great discussion, but we should probably finish up here. Susie, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a fantastic chat.
No, thanks very much for having me.